After my son told me my blue-collar vibe would embarrass his elite friends at our family Christmas dinner, I did not yell or argue. I simply nodded, walked back to my truck, and canceled the $9,500 monthly mortgage transfer I had been secretly paying for him. 2 days later, my silent phone suddenly exploded with 30 missed calls and frantic text messages. My name is Richard Caldwell, and I am 70 years old. The freezing wind whipped across my face on the evening of December 23rd. The snow was falling thick and fast over Newton, Massachusetts, blanketing the manicured lawns of the upscale neighborhood. I was standing on the grand front porch of a sprawling $1.8 million mansion. My bare, calloused hands that had spent 40 years pouring concrete and framing houses so my family could have a better life, were tightly gripping a vintage aluminum pie tin. Inside that tin was a freshly baked pecan pie made exactly the way my late wife, Patricia, used to make it. It had been 4 years since cancer took her from me, and baking her recipes was my way of keeping her memory alive for our son Derek. I pressed the glowing high-tech doorbell, expecting to hear my 38-year-old son's voice or maybe the happy chaos of holiday preparations. Instead, the heavy oak door swung open just a crack. My daughter-in-law, Monica, stood there. She was 36, dressed in a sleek designer evening gown, holding a crystal wine glass. She did not open the door wide to let the warmth of the house spill out into the freezing cold. She stood firmly in the doorway, blocking my path, her eyes darting nervously toward the street before landing on my worn flannel shirt and scuffed work boots. "Richard," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, hushed whisper. "What are you doing here?" "I thought Derek told you the plan had changed." I blinked, pulling my coat tighter against the biting wind. "Changed," we agreed. "Last month I would bring Patricia's pie for the Christmas dinner. It is a family tradition." Monica sighed, a sharp, irritated sound that clouded the freezing air between us. She looked me up and down, her gaze lingering on my faded jacket with undeniable disgust. "Look," she said, crossing her arms tightly. "Derek was supposed to call you. I am hosting a highly exclusive networking dinner tonight. The CEO of Derek's firm is inside, along with several very important investors from the country club. The seating chart is completely finalized. To be perfectly honest, Richard, your blue-collar vibe and your whole rustic aesthetic just do not fit the atmosphere we are trying to curate tonight. Your presence would make things incredibly awkward for our guests." I stood there, the warm pie tin slowly turning freezing cold in my hands. The words hung in the air like icicles. My blue-collar vibe, the very vibe that had paid the massive down payment on the very porch she was standing on. Before I could process the sheer audacity of her insult, the door opened a little wider. Derek stepped up behind his wife. He was wearing a tailored Italian suit that cost more than my first car. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, looking anywhere but directly into my eyes. "Dad, I am so sorry," Derek stammered, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "Monica is right. I meant to call you earlier today. This is strictly a business event. These elite executives are incredibly demanding, and I am under immense pressure right now. You know how it is. I am just trying to secure a promotion so I can keep my head above water. The pressure of this massive mortgage is drowning me, Dad. I am just trying to survive. We will do a late family Christmas next week, just the three of us. I promise." He offered a weak, pitiful smile, waiting for me to play my usual role. The understanding father. The quiet, supportive old man who always stepped aside to let his son shine. I looked at Derek. I looked at the extravagant chandelier glittering in the foyer behind him, the catering staff in crisp white shirts carrying silver trays of champagne, and the roaring fireplace warming their massive vaulted living room. Then I thought about his words. The pressure of this massive mortgage is drowning me. That specific sentence echoed in my mind, drowning out the howling wind. It was a lie so bold, so utterly ridiculous, that it felt like a physical blow to my chest. Derek was not drowning under the weight of his mortgage, because Derek was not paying his mortgage. I was. For the past 3 years, exactly, on the 24th of every single month, I had an automatic bank transfer set up. $9,500 moved silently from my retirement savings directly into Derek's checking account to cover the loan on this beautiful, pristine house. He had come to me crying 3 years ago, claiming his new business ventures were draining his liquid cash, and I, being the protective father Patricia always loved, Tio signed his loan and quietly shouldered the burden so my son would not lose his dream home. Yet here he was standing in a designer suit, hosting a luxury-catered dinner party for the local elite, looking me directly in the eyes and claiming the mortgage was drowning him. If he was not paying the mortgage, where was his lucrative corporate salary going? I did not raise my voice. I did not demand to be let in. I did not throw the pie or remind them of the hundreds of thousands of dollars I had quietly sacrificed for their comfort. 40 years on construction sites taught me that when a foundation is rotten, you do not yell at the cracks. You simply step back before the building collapses. I understand, Derek, I said calmly, my voice steady despite the freezing wind cutting through my clothes. I would not want to ruin your important evening or disrupt your curated atmosphere. You focus on surviving your financial pressures. I turned around and walked down the snow-covered steps. I heard the heavy oak door click shut behind me, locking me out into the cold dark. I walked to my old reliable Ford truck, climbed into the driver's seat, and set the pie on the passenger seat. My hands were trembling not from the winter chill but from a sudden sharp clarity. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I opened my mobile banking app. The screen illuminated the dark cabin of the truck. I navigated to the Scheduled Transfers tab. There it was. The automatic payment. $9,500 scheduled to be withdrawn tomorrow morning, December 24th, just as it had been for the last 36 months. My thumb hovered over the screen for only a fraction of a second. Then I pressed cancel. A small prompt popped up asking me to confirm the deletion of the recurring transfer. I hit confirm. The screen blinked and the scheduled payment vanished into thin air. I tossed the phone onto the dashboard, started the engine, and drove away from the glittering mansion. I drove back to my modest, quiet home, eating Patricia's pie alone in my kitchen, while my phone sat powered off on the counter. I knew the bank would automatically attempt to draft the mortgage payment from Derek's account on the 25th. And for the first time in 3 years, my safety net would not be there to catch him. The silence in my kitchen was deafening. I sat alone at the small wooden table, the same table where Patricia and I had shared countless morning coffees, and stared at the pecan pie. I cut a single slice, the crust flaking perfectly, just the way she taught me, but the taste was entirely lost on me. Every bite felt like ashes. My mind was completely consumed by the sheer audacity of my son's words. The pressure of this massive mortgage is drowning me. He had looked me right in the eye, wearing a suit that cost more than a month of groceries, and fed me a lie. So transparent, it was insulting. I looked over at the kitchen counter. My phone sat there completely dark, a silent metallic rectangle that held the power to shatter his carefully constructed illusion. For 40 years, I had built a life on the foundation of honesty and hard work. I poured concrete-framed houses and broke my back in the freezing Boston winters, so Derek would never have to know the feeling of calloused hands or an empty wallet. I gave him the world, and in return, he gave me a locked door and a fabricated story about financial pressure. 3 years ago, when he and Monica decided they absolutely needed that sprawling mansion in Newton, Derek came to me in a state of near panic. He told me his new corporate position required a certain zip code, a certain image, but his liquid assets were tied up in investments. He practically begged me to co-sign the loan, promising he could handle the monthly payments once his annual bonuses kicked in. I agreed because that is what a father does. But within 2 months, the excuses started. The bonuses were delayed. The house needed immediate renovations to impress his colleagues. The roof needed fixing. The landscaping needed a professional touch. So I stepped in. I set up that automatic transfer of $9,500. Every 24th of the month, like clockwork. A massive chunk of my retirement savings flowed quietly into his account to ensure the mortgage was paid on the 25th. It was supposed to be temporary. Temporary turned into 3 years, 36 months of silent, unconditional support. And his gratitude was to leave me standing in the freezing snow because my flannel shirt did not match his aesthetic. When the sun rose on the morning of December 24th, the house was colder than usual. I normally woke up early, but today I stayed in bed a little longer, watching the snow gently fall outside my window. Today was the day. For the past 3 years, my bank would send me a polite automated notification at exactly 8 in the morning, confirming the successful transfer of funds. I waited. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked away the seconds. 8 o'clock came and went. There was no notification. There was no transfer. The money stayed firmly in my account. A strange mixture of guilt and profound relief washed over me. I had cut the cord. I walked into the living room and looked at the photographs lining the mantel. Pictures of Derek as a boy, smiling, holding a baseball glove, completely unaware of country clubs or elite networking dinners. I wondered at what point that boy had vanished, replaced by a man who valued the opinions of wealthy strangers over the father who had given him everything. I spent the rest of Christmas Eve chopping firewood and tending to the house, keeping my hands busy so my mind would not wander back to that mansion. Christmas Day arrived wrapped in a heavy, suffocating silence. It was the first time in 38 years that I did not spend the holiday with my son. I roasted a small chicken, made a modest portion of mashed potatoes, and sat by the fire. Patricia used to love Christmas. She would fill this house with the smell of cinnamon and pine, playing old holiday records and forcing me to dance with her in the kitchen. She always believed that family was the only true wealth a person could possess. If she could see Derek now hiding behind his designer clothes and locking his own father out in the cold, it would have broken her heart. I was glad she was not here to witness this profound disappointment. As the evening wore on, the isolation began to feel less like a punishment and more like a necessary cleanse. I was detoxing from the constant demands, the subtle disrespect, and the endless financial drain. I went to sleep that night, knowing the storm was gathering just over the horizon, waiting to break. The morning of December 26th dawned clear, the winter sun reflecting blindingly off the fresh snow. I brewed a strong pot of black coffee, poured it into my favorite ceramic mug, and finally walked over to the kitchen counter. My phone had been powered off for nearly 3 days. I picked it up, feeling the cold weight of the device in my palm. I took a very slow, deep breath, bracing myself for the inevitable fallout. I held down the power button. The screen glowed to life, displaying the manufacturer logo before transitioning to the home screen. Immediately, the phone began to vibrate violently in my hand. It buzzed and chimed relentlessly, desperate notifications flooding in all at once. The screen filled with alerts, overlapping and stacking on top of each other. There were 30 missed calls. All of them were from Derek. The text messages followed a cascading waterfall of panic. "Dad, where are you, Dad? Please answer your phone. The bank just sent me an alert. My account is completely overdrawn. What happened to the transfer? Dad, please call me back immediately. This is an absolute emergency. The bank is threatening me." I stood perfectly still, sipping my hot coffee, watching the screen light up with his terror. I watched the glowing screen of my phone with a strange, detached fascination. The digital clock in the upper corner read 8:15 in the morning on December 26th, but the notifications flooding the display told a story of a crisis that had been building for the last 48 hours. 30 missed calls. The red number sat there like a badge of dishonor. Below it, a rapid-fire sequence of text messages previewed the unraveling of my son's carefully constructed world. I opened the message thread. Derek's panic was meticulously documented. The first message had arrived on Christmas morning, just an hour after the bank typically processed my transfer. It read, "Dad, did you forget to authorize the wire? The bank sent me an alert. Please fix this immediately. I have expenses clearing today." 4 hours later, the tone shifted to simmering frustration. "Dad, this is not funny. Stop ignoring me. Monica's credit card got declined at the country club brunch because the account is overdrawn. You are embarrassing us. Call me right now." By evening, the frustration curdled into outright panic. "Dad, where are you? The bank is threatening severe overdraft penalties. I do not have liquid cash to cover this mortgage payment right now. You promised you had this handled. Please, I am begging you, pick up the phone." The final message had come through just 10 minutes ago. It was a desperate plea. "Dad, please. I am drowning here. The bank is sending a formal notice of default. My account is locked. I need that $9,500 today, or everything falls apart. Call me back." I set the phone face up on the kitchen counter and walked away from it. I did not type out a reassuring reply. I did not dial his number to offer a comforting lie or a quick financial rescue. Instead, I walked into the living room, retrieved cardboard boxes from the hall closet, and began the quiet, methodical process of taking down Patricia's Christmas decorations. The house was incredibly still, save for the sudden jarring vibrations of the phone buzzing against the granite countertop in the other room. Every buzz was a testament to my son's unraveling reality. But here in the living room, I felt nothing but a profound, almost icy clarity. I carefully unwound the garland from the staircase railing. I unhooked the delicate glass ornaments from the tree wrapping, each one exactly as Patricia taught me. She had bought these ornaments during our first year of marriage, back when we lived in a cramped apartment, and I was working double shifts to keep the heat on. We had nothing back then, but we had peace because we lived within our means. I placed a fragile hand-painted angel into the box. As I worked, the sheer absurdity of Derek's panic began to settle heavily in my mind. Derek was not a struggling college student trying to make ends meet. He was a 38-year-old director of sales at a major firm. He wore tailored suits. He drove luxury vehicles. Monica flaunted designer handbags and hosted catered networking dinners for the local elite. His base salary alone was comfortably in the mid-six figures. I asked myself, folding a red velvet tree skirt, where exactly was all his money going? If missing a single month of my secret financial subsidy caused his bank account to lock up and trigger a default notice, his financial foundation was not just cracked. It was entirely non-existent. He was living paycheck to paycheck, or rather from mine to his next extravagant purchase. The math simply did not add up. A man making his kind of money should not be sent into a tailspin over a single missed transfer. Unless, of course, the mortgage was not the only thing he was failing to pay. Unless the lifestyle Monica was so desperate to protect was built entirely on a mountain of high-interest debt and my stolen retirement funds. The phone in the kitchen buzzed again. A long vibration indicated an incoming call. I paused my packing, wiped a thin layer of dust from my hands onto my jeans, and walked slowly back into the kitchen. I stared down at the device. Derek calling was flashing across the screen in bright, desperate letters. I leaned against the counter and simply watched it ring. I watched the screen glow, feeling the phantom weight of the past 3 years lifting from my shoulders. I spent 36 months acting as a silent shock absorber for his poor decisions, terrified that if I let him fall, he would lose everything. But shielding him from the consequences of his own vanity had not saved him. It only taught him my hard-earned money was a disposable resource, and my presence in his life was entirely optional. The ringing eventually stopped. The screen went dark, logging the 31st missed call. The silence returned thicker and more resolute than before. I picked up the phone and slipped it into the front pocket of my jacket. The time for blind, unconditional financial support was officially over. If Derek was truly facing a formal notice of default from the bank, then the situation was far more severe than a simple overdraft fee. Banks do not issue formal default notices over a delay of 24 hours. A formal notice meant there was a pattern of delinquency. It meant there was a massive underlying rot that I had been completely blind to. I grabbed my keys from the hook and stepped out into the crisp, freezing morning air. The snow crunched loudly under my boots as I walked toward my truck. I was not going to drive to Newton to rescue him. I was going to find out exactly how deep this hole was. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the driveway, heading for the city to see my attorney. The drive into Boston was a blur of gray slush and brake lights, but my mind was entirely focused on the destination ahead. I navigated the heavy morning traffic with a mechanical precision, my hands gripping the steering wheel of my truck until my knuckles turned white under the strain. I was heading straight to the financial district, to a towering glass building that housed the law offices of Jonathan Mitchell. Jonathan was not just a brilliant financial attorney. He was an old friend, a man who had guided my construction business through decades of tax laws and contract disputes. More importantly, he was the only person who had explicitly warned me against signing a luxury mortgage document for my son 3 years ago. I should have listened to him back then, but a father's blind love often overrides the sharpest legal advice. Now I needed his expertise to uncover exactly what kind of financial disaster my son had dragged me into. I parked my truck in the underground garage, ignoring the stares of men in tailored suits as I walked toward the elevator banks. My boots left wet tracks across the polished marble floor of the lobby. I rode the elevator up to the 40th floor, my jaw set tight. When the doors opened, I bypassed the plush waiting area and the polite greeting of the receptionist, walking straight down the carpeted hallway toward the corner office. His office door was open. Jonathan was sitting behind his massive oak desk, reviewing a stack of legal briefs, his reading glasses perched low on the bridge of his nose. He looked up, surprised by my sudden, unannounced appearance. Richard, he said, taking off his glasses and setting them down. What are you doing here? You look like you just walked out of a winter blizzard. I stepped into his office and closed the heavy wooden door behind me, sealing us off from the hum of the firm. I walked over to the leather guest chair and sat down, heavily resting my hands on my knees. I need you to pull the financial records for the house in Newton. I said, my voice steady but carrying an undeniable weight. I need to see the mortgage statements, the credit history, the payment logs, everything tied to that property. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing in immediate concern. He did not ask for pleasantries. He knew me well enough to recognize the absolute seriousness in my tone. He simply reached for his computer mouse and woke up his monitors. Did something happen with Derek? He asked quietly, his fingers already moving across the keyboard. I canceled the monthly transfer yesterday, I replied. I finally stopped sending him the $9,500. This morning I woke up to 30 missed calls and a barrage of messages claiming the bank locked his accounts and sent a default notice. Jonathan, banks do not issue formal default warnings because a transfer is 12 hours late. Something is incredibly wrong, and since my name is on that deed as a guarantor, I have the legal right to know exactly what is happening with my financial liability. Jonathan nodded slowly, his expression tightening into a mask of pure professional focus. You are absolutely right. As a guarantor on the loan, you have full authorization to access the primary lending portal. Give me a moment to log into the secure server. I sat in silence while the rhythmic clicking of his keyboard filled the room. The tension in the air was palpable, thick and suffocating, like the humid air before a severe thunderstorm. I looked out the massive windows, watching the tiny cars moving through the snow-covered streets far below. I thought about the decades I spent carefully managing my money, saving every extra dollar, building my retirement fund brick by brick. I had never missed a payment in my life. I had never bounced a check. I paid my debts on time, and I taught my son to do the same. Yet here I was, sitting in a law office, holding my breath while a computer processed the potential ruin of my financial reputation. The loading screen on the monitor seemed to spin for an eternity. The secure portal required multiple layers of verification, each passing second stretching my nerves thinner. I could hear the faint hum of the heating vent above us. I thought about Monica standing on her pristine porch, looking down at me with utter contempt. I thought about the tailored suit Derek wore and his desperate, frantic text messages. The contrast between their outward display of elite wealth and the internal reality of an overdrawn bank account made me physically sick to my stomach. Suddenly, the clicking stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. I turned away from the window and looked back at my attorney. Jonathan was staring at his primary monitor. The soft blue light of the screen reflected off his face, but it was not the light that made him look pale. The color had completely drained from his cheeks. His eyes darted rapidly across the digital lines of text, reading the data again, as if trying to force the numbers to make sense. He swallowed hard, his throat bobbing in the quiet room. He slowly took his hand off the mouse and let it fall to his desk. He did not look at me. "Jonathan," I said, leaning forward in my chair, "tell me what you see." He remained silent for a moment, his chest rising and falling, with a deep, heavy breath. When he finally lifted his head to meet my gaze, his eyes were filled with a profound, terrifying pity. It was the look of a man who had just discovered a terminal diagnosis and had to deliver the devastating news to his oldest, closest friend. The glowing screen right before him held the absolute truth about my son's impending financial disaster. Jonathan slowly reached out and turned the heavy computer monitor around so it faced me directly. The sharp glare of the screen illuminated rows of numbers and red warning flags that I did not need a law degree to understand. I leaned forward, scanning the official bank portal. There, under the primary loan account for the Newton property, was a glaring block of text highlighted in crimson. Account status was listed as severely delinquent. Next to it, the words "pre-foreclosure proceedings initiated" were stamped like a death sentence. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to bridge the gap between the reality of those red letters and the reality I thought I knew. I looked up at Jonathan, seeking some kind of alternative explanation. A system glitch, anything that made sense. "Jonathan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "what exactly am I looking at right now?" Jonathan folded his hands on the desk, his expression somber. "Richard," he began, his tone carrying the careful weight of a seasoned attorney delivering terrible news. "Derek has not simply missed a single payment because you canceled your transfer yesterday. According to the internal banking ledger, Derek has not made a single mortgage payment on that property in 6 consecutive months. The formal default notice is the final declaration before they seize the house." The words hit me with the physical force of a sledgehammer. 6 months. I sat back, all the air rushing out of my lungs. 6 months meant half a year of absolute deliberate deception. My mind immediately began to run the terrible math. Every single month on the 24th day, I had transferred exactly $9,500 into his primary checking account. Over 6 months, that amounted to exactly $57,000. $57,000 specifically required to secure the roof over his head. If the bank had not received a single dime of that money since June, where on earth had it gone? I placed my hands flat on the desk to stop them from trembling. "I sent him the money, Jonathan. Every single month without fail, the funds entered his account. If he did not pay the bank, he stole it. I need to know where my money went. Can you pull the transaction history for his linked checking account?" Jonathan nodded. "Because your initial transfer account was established as a direct funding source during loan origination. The system allows us to view the basic routing ledger. Let me run a trace on the numbers." He turned the monitor back toward himself and began typing rapidly. The silence in the office was suffocating. I thought about Monica standing on her immaculate porch, looking at my flannel shirt with absolute disgust. I thought about Derek claiming the pressure of the mortgage was drowning him. Jonathan sighed heavily. He turned the screen back toward me, pointing to a list of outgoing expenditures that painted a picture so vile I could hardly stomach it. "Richard," Look at these outgoing debits, Jonathan said, his voice laced with quiet anger. This is what your son has been doing with your retirement savings. I focused on the highlighted lines. On the 25th of every month, exactly when the mortgage was due, a transfer of $2,000 was routed directly to the Oak Bridge Country Club to cover the elite membership dues for Monica. A few lines down, another automated payment of $1,800 was sent to a luxury auto leasing firm for a brand new Porsche Cayenne. The rest of the page was littered with high-end Aspen ski resorts and massive bills from elite catering companies. My $57,000 had not gone toward protecting their home. It had been systematically drained to fund an entirely fraudulent, billionaire lifestyle. I had been sacrificing my golden years just so my daughter-in-law could parade around a country club and sip champagne. My son had taken the sweat off my brow and converted it into a pathetic, hollow costume of wealth. The betrayal was so profound it transcended anger. It was a deep, chilling realization that the man I raised prioritized the illusion of success over the security of his own family. He had used my unconditional love to finance his vanity. I stared at the lines of data until the numbers blurred together. Derek had executed a sustained, calculated campaign of financial exploitation. He knew exactly what he was doing every time he smiled and thanked me for my support. He knew the bank was inching closer to foreclosure, yet he continued to fund country club brunches instead of saving his home. He believed he could push the impending disaster down the road, assuming I would simply bail him out once the inevitable collapse occurred. Jonathan leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. Richard, I am so deeply sorry. This is a severe breach of trust. But as your attorney, I need you to focus on the immediate legal reality. Because you co-signed that original mortgage, this delinquency is actively destroying your credit score. The bank is preparing to initiate the foreclosure auction. If they seize that property and sell it at a loss, they will come after your personal assets to cover the deficit. Your son has placed your entire life savings directly in the crosshairs. I closed my eyes, taking a slow, grounding breath. The pain of the betrayal was raw, burning deeply in my chest, but I could not afford the luxury of grief right now. I opened my eyes, the cold, pragmatic mind of a lifelong contractor finally taking over. When you discover a completely rotten support beam hidden behind fresh paint, you do not sit around and cry over the damaged wood. You rip it out immediately before it brings down the entire structure. I looked across the desk at Jonathan, my previous shock dissolving, my resolve hardening into solid, unbreakable steel. I left Jonathan's office with a mind as cold and clear as the ice cracking loudly under my tires. The initial shock of the betrayal had evaporated, leaving behind a sharp-focused determination. I drove back home and spent a restless night mapping out my next steps. The following morning, I drove to the corner diner, a faded brick building smelling heavily of stale coffee and fried bacon. I ordered my standard $6 breakfast of scrambled eggs, burnt toast, and black coffee. Sitting in my booth near the window, I ignored the fact that my son had been leaving frantic voicemails on my phone since sunrise. Derek was desperate, and desperate men do not simply give up when their funding gets cut off. Right on cue, the diner bell jingled violently. Derek stood in the entryway looking wildly out of place in his tailored wool overcoat and crisp designer shirt, his Italian leather shoes slipping on the wet linoleum floor. His hair was heavily disheveled, and his eyes were wide with frantic energy. He scanned the crowded room, his gaze sweeping past the tired mechanics, until he finally spotted me sitting quietly in the back corner. He marched over, sliding roughly into the vinyl booth across from me. He leaned forward, bracing his elbows on the sticky table, his breath coming in rapid, panicked gasps. "Dad," he hissed, keeping his voice low to avoid drawing attention from the waitstaff. "What exactly is wrong with you? I have been trying to reach you for 3 straight days. You completely abandoned us right in the middle of a massive financial crisis." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my cheap coffee, letting the bitter liquid burn the back of my throat. I looked at the dark, exhausted circles under his eyes and the absolute panic vibrating through his expensive clothes. What financial crisis, Derek? I asked mildly, cutting a small piece of my burnt toast. Last time we spoke on your pristine porch, you told me you were just trying to survive your immense mortgage pressure. Derek swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously around the diner. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping an octave as he delivered the desperate lie he had undoubtedly rehearsed during his frantic drive over here. Dad, there was a massive banking glitch over the holiday weekend. Their internal system completely crashed and locked my primary accounts. Because of this ridiculous error, my mortgage payment did not process, and the automated system sent out a default warning by mistake. It is an absolute nightmare. Monica was utterly humiliated at the country club when her card declined, and I currently have several vendors threatening to sue me over bounced checks. I need cash immediately to bridge the gap until the bank fixes their broken software issue. I quietly chewed my toast, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression. A massive banking glitch. It was a fascinating choice of words. He was sitting across from the man who had just reviewed his official banking ledger. The man who knew he had not made a single payment in 6 months, and he was blaming a weekend software error for his impending foreclosure. I looked at the gold watch gleaming brightly on his wrist, a piece of luxury jewelry that likely cost more than my entire truck. How much do you need to bridge this gap? I asked, keeping my tone mild and supportive. Derek let out a breath he had clearly been holding, his shoulders dropping in relief as he assumed I was taking the bait. $10,000, he said quickly. I need $10,000 in a cashier's check by tomorrow morning. It will cover the delayed mortgage draft and keep the vendors quiet. I swear to you, Dad, as soon as the bank resolves this glitch, I will pay you back every single cent. I just need you to save me this one last time. I stared at him, feeling a deep, hollow sorrow for the man my son had become. He was sitting there begging for $10,000, completely oblivious to the fact that I already knew about the $57,000 he had stolen from me to fund his wife's luxury lifestyle. I was playing me for an absolute fool, banking on my paternal instinct to blind me to his blatant corruption. I did not raise my voice. I did not throw my coffee in his face or slide the foreclosure documents across the table. Confronting him right now would only cause him to panic and hide whatever remaining assets he had. I needed him comfortable. I needed him to believe that his safety net was still firmly in place while I quietly dismantled the ground beneath his feet. I understand, son, I said softly, setting my fork down. Banking errors can be incredibly stressful. You should not have to worry about losing your home over a software glitch. Let me go to my bank this afternoon and look into my finances. I will see what accounts I can move around to get you that cashier's check by tomorrow. Derek closed his eyes, a genuine smile breaking across his panicked face. Oh, thank you, God. Dad, you have no idea how much this means to me. Thank you. I promise this is the last time. Monica and I appreciate you so much. He stood up, buttoning his expensive wool coat, his confidence visibly restored. He patted the table, gave me a quick, empty smile, and practically jogged out of the diner. The bell jingled as the door closed behind him. I sat alone in the booth, watching his luxury SUV speed out of the snowy parking lot. I picked up my phone and dialed the number Jonathan had given me for Victor Thorne, the private investigator. Derek honestly thought he had just secured $10,000. He had absolutely no idea he had just bought me the time I needed to completely destroy him. I sat in the diner booth for a long time, after Derek rushed out into the winter snow. My coffee had grown entirely cold, a bitter reflection of the sudden chill that had settled permanently in my chest. He had looked me directly in the eyes and begged for $10,000, claiming it was the only way to save his family from a temporary banking error. He had no idea that I already knew about the $57,000 he had siphoned away over the last 6 months to pay for country club memberships and luxury cars. However, even with those extravagant expenses, the math still felt incomplete. A leased Porsche and a country club membership were expensive, but they did not account for the sheer velocity of his financial ruin. There was a missing piece to this puzzle, a massive drain on his resources that I had not yet identified. I thought back to the brief condescending conversation I had with Monica on their frozen porch. She had been hosting an elite networking dinner, desperately trying to elevate her social status. For months, I had seen her posting endlessly on her public social media profiles about her brand new high-end wellness spa opening in the city. She called herself a self-made entrepreneur, constantly bragging about the imported Italian marble floors and the expensive organic treatments she offered. Starting a luxury business requires an immense amount of upfront capital. Where did a woman who had not worked a steady job in a decade suddenly find the money to build a premium wellness spa? I pulled my phone from my jacket pocket and found the contact card Jonathan had shared with me earlier that morning. It belonged to a man named Victor Thorne, a highly recommended private investigator who specialized in forensic accounting and asset tracking. I dialed the number. Victor answered on the second ring, his voice crisp and entirely professional. I gave him a brief, unvarnished summary of my situation, leaving out the emotional pain and focusing strictly on the financial discrepancies. He instructed me to meet him at his office on the outskirts of the city within the hour. Victor operated out of a modest, unmarked brick building that perfectly matched his discreet profession. I was a sharp, observant man in his late 50s with piercing gray eyes that seemed to evaluate every detail of my posture as I sat across from his metal desk. I handed him a printed sheet containing Monica's full legal name, the address of her new wellness spa, and the links to her public social media accounts where she proudly displayed her supposed wealth. I need to know exactly how this spa was funded, I told Victor, leaning forward in my chair. My son has defaulted on a massive mortgage, a mortgage that I am legally bound to as a guarantor. Yet his wife just opened a luxury business that requires hundreds of thousands of dollars in startup capital. They do not have private investors. They do not have generational wealth. I need you to track the money. Find out if they took out hidden commercial loans or if there are other accounts draining their primary income. Victor took the paper, scanning the information with a practiced, neutral expression. He tapped his pen against the desk, his mind already working through the investigative process. Corporate filings and commercial leases leave a very distinct paper trail, Mr. Caldwell, he said calmly. If she opened a luxury spa, there will be vendor contracts, permit applications, and funding declarations filed with the state. I will pull the corporate registration and trace the initial capital injections. I can cross-reference her business accounts with public lion registries to see who holds the debt. Give me 48 hours. I will hand you a comprehensive report detailing every single dollar that flowed into that building. I thanked him, paid his retainer fee in cash, and walked into the freezing air. The waiting was the hardest part. I drove back home and spent the next 2 long days trapped in a suffocating limbo. Derek continued to text me his messages, oscillating between false gratitude for my promised help and rising panic as the hours ticked by without a cashier's check materializing. I ignored every single one of them. I kept my hands busy, repairing a broken cabinet in the kitchen and organizing the garage, trying to drown out the sorrow that threatened to pull me under. I kept thinking about Patricia. She had always believed the best in people, especially our son. She poured so much love into raising him to be a man of integrity. To see him now twisted by greed and willing to manipulate his own father for a $10,000 handout would have shattered her gentle spirit. I was quietly thankful she was spared from this nightmare. By the late afternoon of the second day, the winter sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, dark shadows across my living room floor. The 48-hour window Victor Thorne requested was rapidly closing, and the anticipation was making my skin crawl. I sat in my armchair, staring at the muted television, waiting for the truth to finally arrive. Suddenly, my phone rang. The harsh digital tone shattered the absolute silence of the house. I snatched it from the side table, expecting to see the private investigator's name flashing across the screen. Instead, the caller identification displayed Jonathan Mitchell's law firm. I answered the call, pressing the phone tightly against my ear. "Jonathan?" I asked, my voice tight with tension. "Did Victor send you the financial report on the spa?" Richard Jonathan said. His voice did not sound steady or professional. It sounded genuinely terrified. A cold spike of adrenaline shot straight through my chest. Forget the private investigator for a moment. You need to get back to my office right now. We missed something huge on the deed. The drive back to the financial district felt entirely different from my first visit. 2 days ago, I was a father seeking clarity on a delayed mortgage payment. Today, the freezing winter wind whipping against my truck matched the icy dread settling deep inside my chest. Jonathan had said we missed something huge on the deed, and the sheer terror in his voice left absolutely no room for misinterpretation. My mind raced through every possible scenario as I navigated the slick, snow-covered streets of Boston. I thought about the $57,000 already missing shown from my retirement savings. I thought about the impending foreclosure. Whatever Jonathan had found, it was bad enough to make a seasoned attorney lose his professional composure. I pulled into the same underground parking garage, slammed the truck into park, and hurried toward the elevator banks. The ride up to the 40th floor felt agonizingly slow. The polished metal doors finally slid open, and I walked straight past the receptionist's desk, not bothering to stop or announce my arrival. Jonathan was standing behind his large oak desk, completely ignoring the scenic view of the city skyline behind him. His tie was loosened, and several thick manila folders were spread chaotically across his usually immaculate workspace. He looked up as I entered and closed the heavy wooden door behind me. He did not offer a greeting. Instead, he pointed to the leather guest chair across from him, signaling for me to sit down immediately. I took my seat, unbuttoning my thick winter coat, preparing myself for whatever blow was about to land. Jonathan took a deep breath and picked up a single sheet of heavy legal-sized paper from the center of his desk. He did not read from it right away. He just held it in his hands, looking at me with a profound sense of gravity. Richard, he began, his voice low and steady. When you were here on Tuesday, we pulled the primary lending portal to check the status of the initial mortgage. We focused entirely on the delinquency and the pre-foreclosure warnings, because that was the immediate threat. We looked at the outgoing cash flow from his checking account to see where your money went. But because I was so focused on the primary loan, I failed to check the secondary lien registry attached to the property deed. I frowned, leaning forward in my chair. A secondary lien registry. I asked, my confusion momentarily overriding my fear. What does that mean, Jonathan? We only took out one mortgage when they bought that house. Jonathan slid the piece of paper across the polished surface of the desk until it stopped directly in front of me. This is a public record filed with the county clerk 8 months ago, he explained. It is a home equity line of credit. It is a secondary loan taken out against the accrued value of the property. Your son did not just stop paying the primary mortgage, Richard. He used the house as collateral to extract a massive sum of liquid cash from a completely different lending institution. I stared at the black text printed on the white paper. The legal jargon was dense, but the numbers were impossible to misunderstand. There, boldly printed near the top of the document, was the total authorized draw amount, $300,000. My stomach dropped completely out of my body. A cold sweat broke out across the back of my neck. $300,000, I repeated out loud, my voice sounding hollow and completely foreign to my own ears. I looked up from the page, desperately searching Jonathan's face for some indication that this was a terrible mistake. Derek borrowed $300,000 against the house. Jonathan nodded solemnly. According to the disbursement records, the entire credit line was drawn down almost immediately after it was approved. The funds were routed to a commercial business account. The missing piece of the puzzle suddenly slammed into place with a sickening thud. The sheer velocity of his financial ruin finally made absolute sense. Monica's brand new wellness spa, the imported Italian marble floors, the expensive organic treatments, the endless social media posts bragging about her self-made success. She had not secured private investors. She had not saved her own money. She and Derek had secretly hollowed out the equity of their home, transforming the property into a giant piggy bank to finance her vanity project. They had drained the house of its value while simultaneously refusing to pay the foundational mortgage that kept a roof over their heads. The betrayal was so staggering, so comprehensively destructive, that it defied all logic. They had gambled their entire future on a high-end spa using money they did not actually have and left me completely blind to the mounting disaster. But as the initial wave of nausea subsided, a sharp, glaring inconsistency suddenly pierced through my shock. I looked back down at the document resting on the desk, tracing the lines of the contractual agreement with my calloused finger. I slowly raised my head and locked eyes with Jonathan. "Jonathan," I said, spacing my words out with absolute precision. "This makes absolutely no sense. I am the primary co-signer on the original mortgage for that specific property. My name is firmly attached to the master deed. I have purchased houses and navigated commercial real estate for 40 long years. I know exactly how these strict banking regulations operate." I tapped the paper firmly with my index finger, my voice growing colder by the second. "In order to pull equity from a co-signed house, the lending institution requires explicit authorization from every single party listed on the title. Derek cannot legally secure a secondary loan without my direct approval. I never saw this document. I never received a phone call from a bank. I never authorized this massive withdrawal. How did he bypass the requirement for my consent?" The drive back into the financial district felt like a death march. Today, the freezing winter wind whipping against the windshield matched the icy dread settling deep inside my chest. Jonathan had said we missed something huge on the deed. The terror vibrating in his voice left no room for misinterpretation. I pulled into the parking garage, slammed the truck into park, and hurried toward the elevators. The metal doors slid open, and I walked past the receptionist without a single word. Jonathan was standing behind his desk, thick folders spread chaotically across his workspace. He pointed to the guest chair, signaling for me to sit. I took my seat, preparing for whatever blow was about to land. Jonathan picked up a single sheet of heavy paper from the center of his desk. "Richard," he began, his voice low and steady. "When you were here earlier this week, we pulled the primary lending portal to check the status of the initial mortgage. Because I was focused on the primary loan default, I failed to check the secondary lien registry attached to the deed." He slid the piece of paper across the desk until it stopped in front of me. "This is a public record filed 8 months ago," he explained. "It is a home equity line of credit. Your son used the house as collateral to extract a massive sum of cash from a different lending institution." I stared down at the black text printed on the white paper. There, printed near the top, was the total authorized draw amount, $300,000. My stomach dropped completely out of my body. The missing piece of the puzzle suddenly slammed into place. Monica's brand new luxury wellness spa. She and Derek secretly hollowed out the equity of their home to finance her vanity project. The betrayal was so staggering that it defied all logic. But as the nausea subsided, a sharp inconsistency pierced through my shock. I slowly raised my head and locked eyes with Jonathan. "This makes absolutely no sense," I said, spacing my words out with precision. "I am the primary co-signer on the original mortgage for that specific property. I know exactly how these strict banking regulations operate. To pull equity from a CO-signed house, the lending institution requires explicit authorization from every party listed on the title. Derek cannot legally secure a secondary loan without my direct approval. I never saw this document. I never received a phone call from a bank. How did he bypass the requirement for my consent?" Jonathan did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into the open folder on his desk and slowly pulled out a second document. His hands were visibly trembling as he placed it gently on top of the first page. "This is the final authorization contract that the secondary lender filed to disburse the $300,000, Jonathan said. "Look at the designated guarantor consent line." I leaned forward, gripping the edges of the desk. My eyes scanned the dense paragraphs until I reached the signature block at the very bottom. There, printed clearly in dark blue ink, was a perfect replication of my exact digital signature. It was the encrypted electronic signature I utilized exclusively for my commercial construction contracts. It was not a sloppy, handwritten forgery. It was a calculated technological theft. My son stole my secure digital credentials, bypassed the authentication using his knowledge of my personal security questions, and digitally signed his own father onto a high-interest loan without my consent. I sat back in my chair, the air completely rushing out of my lungs. Derek had not just made a terrible financial mistake. My son intentionally committed federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. He executed a highly coordinated illegal maneuver to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars by compromising my legal identity. The sheer magnitude of the crime was almost impossible to process. If the primary mortgage defaulted, which it already had, the secondary lender would immediately pursue the guarantors to recoup their losses. Derek was fully willing to let the banks liquidate my retirement accounts, seize my modest home, and send his 70-year-old father to federal prison, just so his wife could have imported marble floors in her luxury spa. The profound sorrow sitting heavily in my chest instantly evaporated. It was incinerated by a sudden consuming wave of absolute, freezing rage. For 38 years, I shielded him from the harsh realities of the world, providing a safety net so massive he never had to feel the consequences of a single bad decision. I thought my unconditional financial support was an act of parental love. But my son viewed it as a weakness to be exploited. He viewed me as a disposable resource, an ignorant bank account that existed solely to fund his arrogant lifestyle. He traded my freedom and my future to buy the hollow affection of a woman who despised me. I looked across the desk at Jonathan. The seasoned attorney was watching me carefully, waiting for the inevitable emotional collapse. I expected me to cry and mourn the catastrophic loss of my only child. But I did not shed a single tear. The man who walked into this office was a grieving father looking for a way to save his struggling son. The man sitting in this chair right now was a seasoned contractor who had just uncovered a malicious criminal rot, threatening to destroy his entire foundation. I reached across the desk, picked up the forged contract, and folded it meticulously before placing it into the inner pocket of my winter coat. I stood up, my posture perfectly straight, the icy dread entirely replaced by a singular destructive focus. "Jonathan," I said, my voice devoid of any warmth or hesitation, "you will help me legally purchase the defaulted promissory note from the primary bank. I will buy my son's debt in full. And once I legally hold the lien to that property, I will tear his entire world apart." I left Jonathan sitting in his office and walked back to the elevator. The anger burning in my chest was no longer a chaotic flame. It had condensed into a cold laser. Derek stole my digital signature to secure a $300,000 loan for a spa. He committed a federal crime to buy the affection of a woman who viewed me as dirt on her shoes. I needed to look at the physical manifestation of my stolen retirement funds. I drove my truck through the busy afternoon traffic toward the most exclusive commercial district in the city. The streets were lined with high-end boutiques. I found a parking spot across from a newly renovated storefront. The exterior was painted a pristine matte white with elegant gold lettering perfectly centered above the heavy glass doors. It proudly read "Serenity Wellness and Aesthetics" in flowing script. I sat in the cold cabin of my truck. I stared at the imported marble visible through the massive windows. Every tile in that building was paid for by the sweat of my brow and the theft of my identity. I took a deep breath to steady my heart. I stepped out and walked across the salted pavement. I pushed open the heavy glass door. A small silver bell chimed softly. The interior of the spa was overwhelming. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and eucalyptus. Soft ambient music played constantly from completely hidden speakers. The lighting was carefully dimmed, to create a specific atmosphere of absolute luxury, exclusivity, and relaxation. It was a world designed to separate wealthy people from their money. I stood in the foyer wearing my faded work jacket and scuffed boots. Several well-dressed clients turned their heads to stare at me. Their eyes swept over my rough appearance with polite confusion. I ignored them. I rolled my shoulders forward and slightly hunched my back. I softened my expression into a mask of harmless confusion. I needed to play the role of a bewildered old man looking for a simple gift. I slowly shuffled toward the sleek reception desk carved from white quartz. A young woman in a crisp gray uniform smiled at me. Before I could speak, a familiar voice drifted over from the plush seating area nearby. It was a sharp and confident tone that I recognized immediately. I paused and turned my head slightly toward the sound. Monica was sitting on a velvet sofa, holding a delicate porcelain teacup. She was surrounded by three young women dressed in equally expensive designer clothing. They were leaning in very closely, completely captivated by whatever dramatic story she was currently spinning. I stood near a display of expensive facial creams and pretended to read the labels while keeping my ears focused on her conversation. She was laughing a bright and practiced sound that echoed through the room. Building this business from the ground up was a nightmare, Monica told her friends, waving her manicured hand dramatically. It takes so much pure dedication to be a self-made entrepreneur here. When Derek and I decided to invest our own capital into this vision, we knew it would be a massive risk. But you have to bet on your own brilliance to achieve this high-end aesthetic. One of the women nodded sympathetically and asked if her family had fully supported the huge financial undertaking. Monica rolled her eyes and let out a long sigh of utter disdain. Derek is wonderfully supportive, she said. But his father is an absolute nightmare to deal with. He is this cheap blue-collar contractor who completely lacks any refined taste. He showed up at my house just before my holiday networking dinner, wearing a filthy flannel shirt. He does not understand high-end aesthetics at all. I had to literally block the door to keep his embarrassing blue-collar vibe away from my elite investors. You simply cannot mix high society with men who have dirt permanently stained under their fingernails. Her friends gasped in theatrical horror and murmured their unwavering support for her difficult situation. I stood perfectly still by the bright display shelf, holding a tiny glass jar of expensive organic moisturizer. My hands did not shake. My heart rate did not elevate. The sheer arrogance of her lies was almost magnificent in its delusion. She was sitting in a building vanity, sipping expensive tea, and publicly mocking the very man whose life savings were currently holding up the roof over her head. I carefully set the small jar back onto the pristine glass shelf. I walked over to the young receptionist who was still waiting politely behind the quartz desk. I smiled warmly, perfectly maintaining the facade of a clueless and harmless grandfather. "Excuse me, miss," I said in a gentle voice. "I am looking to purchase a small gift card for my niece. Do you happen to sell a $50 certificate?" The receptionist smiled brightly and quickly processed my request. She handed me a beautifully embossed card enclosed in a thick silver envelope. I pulled a crisp $50 bill from my wallet and handed it across the counter. I thanked her politely and slowly turned around to leave. As I walked past the velvet sofa, Monica glanced up and saw me. The color instantly drained from her face. Her confident smile vanished into a mask of pure panic. I did not stop. I did not glare at her. I simply offered her a very polite nod and walked out through the heavy glass doors. I stepped back into the freezing winter wind. I slowly walked across the empty street to my cold truck with a profound sense of peace. Monica firmly believed she was a brilliant self-made queen sitting high on an untouchable throne. She had absolutely no idea that her cheap blue-collar father-in-law was already in the process of legally purchasing her entire kingdom. I left the upscale commercial district behind the sweet scent of lavender and eucalyptus from the spa fading as I drove toward the imposing financial center of the city. The primary lending institution that held the original mortgage on the Newton mansion was housed in a massive steel and glass tower. I parked my truck in the adjacent structure and walked through the heavy revolving doors into a cavernous lobby. It was a sterile, unforgiving environment completely devoid of warmth. People in dark suits rushed past me carrying briefcases and staring intensely at their phones. I approached the polished marble reception desk and announced my arrival. I had a scheduled appointment with the regional portfolio manager regarding a severely delinquent account. A young assistant with a practiced, hollow smile escorted me up to the executive suites on the 12th floor. I was led into a spacious corner office overlooking the harbor. The regional manager, a man named Harrison, who looked to be in his late 40s, stood up from behind his desk. He wore a sharp navy suit and offered a firm, highly rehearsed handshake. He gestured for me to sit in one of the plush leather chairs opposite him. Harrison clearly expected this to be a routine, depressing conversation. He probably saw dozens of heartbroken parents every month, desperate people coming in to beg for extensions, offering to drain their modest savings just to buy their irresponsible children a little more time before the inevitable eviction. He opened a thick manila folder on his desk, his eyes scanning the red warning flags printed across the first page. Mr. Caldwell Harrison began, his tone perfectly calibrated to convey professional sympathy mixed with absolute corporate rigidity. I appreciate you coming in today. However, I must be completely transparent regarding the Newton property. The account has been in default for 6 consecutive months. We have already issued the formal notices and the pre-foreclosure process is officially underway. As the co-signer on this loan, your personal credit is actively taking a severe hit. I assume you are here to discuss a payment plan to cover the $57,000 in arrears, or perhaps to negotiate a short sale before we are forced to auction the property. I sat comfortably in the leather chair, keeping my posture relaxed and my expression neutral. I looked out the large window for a brief moment, watching the gray winter clouds gathering over the harbor before bringing my attention back to the bank manager. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a certified financial dossier that Jonathan had prepared for me earlier that morning. I placed it squarely on the desk and slid it across the smooth wooden surface until it rested right next to his folder. I am not here to pay the arrears, Harrison, I said, keeping my voice steady and completely calm. I have absolutely no intention of catching up on missed payments for a mortgage my son abandoned half a year ago, and I am certainly not here to beg for an extension or a short sale. Harrison frowned, clearly confused by my calm demeanor. He placed his hands flat on the desk. Mr. Caldwell, if you do not cover the delinquent amount immediately, we have a fiduciary responsibility to seize the collateral. The bank will auction the house. If it sells for less than the outstanding balance, we will aggressively pursue your personal assets to cover the deficit. You are legally bound to this debt. I am fully aware of my legal obligations, I replied smoothly. That is exactly why I brought my financial disclosures. Open the dossier, please. Harrison hesitated for a second before opening the folder. His eyes dropped to the first page. I watched his professional mask slip, replaced by genuine shock, as he scanned the verified balances of my liquid retirement accounts, my commercial construction holdings, and my untethered investment portfolios. For 40 years, I had poured concrete and lived well below my means, quietly amassing a fortune that my son and his wife knew absolutely nothing about. Harrison swallowed hard, suddenly realizing that the man sitting across from him in a faded flannel shirt was not a desperate broke pensioner. I possessed more than enough liquid capital to buy the entire building we were currently sitting in. As the primary guarantor on that loan, I have a specific legal right to protect my financial standing. I explained, leaning forward slightly. I do not want to reinstate the loan. I want to execute a direct purchase of the promissory note in its entirety. I am offering to buy the debt outright from this institution today in cash for the full outstanding balance. Harrison stared at me, completely taken aback by the sheer scale of the maneuver. This was an incredibly rare legal strategy. Banks generally sold bad debt for pennies on the dollar to predatory collection agencies. Having a private individual, especially the co-signer, step in to purchase a massive luxury mortgage at full face value was almost unheard of. It meant the bank would completely eliminate a toxic asset from their books without losing a single cent. "You want to buy the note?" Harrison asked, his voice losing all its corporate polish. "You want to pay off the entire principal balance today." "I do not want to pay it off," I corrected him sharply. "Paying it off implies retiring the debt and leaving the deed free and clear for my son. I want to purchase the debt. I want your bank to formally assign the promissory note and the deed of trust directly to me. You get your money back in full, your corporate risk drops to zero, and I assume the absolute position of the primary lien holder." Harrison leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the logistics. "If we assign the note to you, you understand that the borrower is still in severe default." I nodded my head slowly. The heavy oak desk in my home office felt entirely different beneath my fingertips this morning. A thick overnight courier envelope rested precisely in the center of the leather blotter. The return address belonged to the premier foreclosure department of the state's largest financial institution. Breaking the tough seal, I extracted the crisp watermarked pages confirming the paperwork had cleared. My signature sat at the bottom of the final page, officially transferring the foreclosure rights directly to me. I was no longer just a desperate co-signer. I had purchased the debt completely. The regional bank happily accepted my cashier's check, washing their hands of the toxic asset. I was now established as the sole lien holder. I slid the documents into a slim black leather briefcase. Stepping out into the crisp morning air, I approached my vehicle with a sense of purpose I had not experienced in decades. The engine roared to life and I steered toward the affluent suburbs. The 40-minute drive offered a stark transition from the bustling city center to the quiet manicured lawns of their gated community. Turning onto their street, I immediately spotted the glaring evidence of their misplaced priorities. A brand new metallic silver sports car sat gleaming in their driveway, replacing the practical sedan they owned just last month. This was the exact luxury purchase they prioritized over fulfilling their mortgage obligations. Parking directly behind the sports car, I locked my doors and walked deliberately up the cobblestone path. Faint bass thumped through the thick front door, indicating an early afternoon gathering. I pressed the illuminated doorbell, listening to the chime echo inside the grand foyer. Heavy footsteps approached. The brass handle clicked, and the door swung open, revealing Derek holding a half-empty crystal glass of imported scotch. He wore a designer silk robe, completely unbothered by the fact that it was barely noon on a Tuesday. His relaxed posture instantly rigidified upon seeing me standing on his porch. He reflexively stepped sideways, attempting to block my view of the lavish, catered spread visible in the dining room behind him. Before he could utter a single syllable of defensive posturing, I raised the black leather briefcase. I unclasped the brass lock and pulled out the primary document, a formally drafted notice of default and immediate intent to evict. I pressed the stiff parchment directly against his chest, forcing his free hand to grab it. Derek stared down at the bold black lettering, his eyes darting frantically across the legal paragraphs. The confusion on his face slowly morphed into genuine terror as he processed the bank's official seal alongside my name listed as the sole primary lien holder. He realized instantly that his institutional safety net had evaporated. There were no faceless bank managers left to manipulate or endless extensions to exploit. His wife Chloe suddenly appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a linen towel. She demanded to know who was interrupting their private lunch. Spotting me, Chloe's demeanor shifted into immediate hostility. She marched forward, attempting to snatch the papers from her husband's trembling grip, loudly declaring that my presence constituted harassment. I raised a single finger, silencing her mid-sentence. I calmly informed them both that they were currently standing on my private property. I explained the exact stipulations of the foreclosure transfer, detailing that since Derek had already defaulted through 4 missed payments, I possessed the absolute power to evict them. They had precisely 30 days to vacate the premises entirely, leaving all original fixtures intact. Chloe's face flushed a deep crimson. She reached into her pocket, pulling out a smartphone, furiously threatening to summon the police to report trespassing. I calmly gestured toward the far end of their landscaped street. A marked patrol cruiser sat idling near the neighborhood entrance. I explained that I had already visited the precinct this morning, presenting my newly acquired deed to the sergeant. The officer was stationed there solely to ensure the delivery of the legal notice proceeded without any physical altercations. Derek dropped the crystal glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor, spilling amber liquid across the expensive rug. He abandoned his aggressive stance, pivoting instantly to desperate pleading. He invoked the names of my 2 grandchildren, begging me not to render his family homeless over a financial misunderstanding. I countered his manipulation immediately. I revealed that a secure, irrevocable trust fund had been established for the children's educational needs. That specific trust was managed by an independent fiduciary, meaning neither he nor Chloe could withdraw a single cent from it. The children were safe. The adults, however, would face the reality of their actions. Turning my back on the shattered glass and their stunned silence, I walked away. I did not wait for further excuses. Halfway down the driveway, the sound of a bitter screaming argument erupted inside the house. The united front they always presented had instantly fractured under the crushing weight of genuine accountability. I reached my car, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the heavy door, sealing out the noise of their collapsing world. Starting the ignition, I dialed the direct number of a ruthless commercial property management firm. A brisk receptionist answered on the first ring. I instructed her to send a complete eviction team to the property precisely on the 31st day, authorizing them to change all the exterior locks and remove any remaining personal belongings. I hung up the phone. Shifting into gear, I drove out of the gated community. As the iron gates closed behind me in the rearview mirror, I drove toward the highway, focusing entirely on the open road ahead. The empty highway stretched out endlessly toward the distant mountains. I merged into the fast lane, accelerating past slow-moving freight trucks. My destination was a small diner located 50 miles away. I needed a quiet space completely disconnected from the exhausting family drama. For the first time in years, I was finally breathing free. The gravel crunched heavily under my tires as I pulled into my narrow driveway. The brief sanctuary of the roadside diner faded instantly. A massive obsidian SUV sat diagonally across my front lawn. Its deep tire tracks carved ugly trenches into the damp soil I had painstakingly seeded last weekend. The driver's side door hung wide open. Before I could even shift my vehicle into park, heavy footsteps pounded across my wooden porch. Derek and Monica materialized from the shadows of my awning, their faces contorted with an unhinged, feral desperation. They stormed into my personal space the second my boots touched the pavement. Derek shoved a crumpled generic envelope directly toward my face. The bold red lettering of their former bank's letterhead dominated the top corner. Derek aggressively tapped his shaking index finger against the black barcode printed across the very bottom margin. He demanded immediate, highly concrete answers regarding the unfamiliar corporate routing numbers. The standardized text bluntly stated that their debt was transferred to a third-party entity, blinded by their own financial illiteracy. They immediately assumed they were being thrown to a predatory collection agency. Derek's voice cracked as he ranted about ruthless corporate liquidators and shadowy repo men. He kicked the base of my porch railing, cursing the regional bank managers for selling their prestigious account to bottom feeders. I unlocked my front door, intending to step inside and close it behind me. Monica wedged her designer heel firmly into the door jamb. She pushed her way into my modest hallway. She brought the sharp, overpowering scent of expensive perfume into my quiet home. Monica paced furiously across my woven area rug. Her manicured hands gestured wildly at the low ceilings and inexpensive furniture. She did not ask for permission to enter. She simply commandeered the space. Her face flushed a mottled crimson as she launched into a blistering tirade. The neighborhood postal worker had accidentally delivered the bank's transfer notice to her next-door neighbor first. That neighbor, a notorious gossip within their gated community, had read the exterior print before handing it over. Monica screamed that the mere rumor of an aggressive debt buyer circling their property was destroying her social standing. She detailed the immediate catastrophic fallout within her elite circles. Her tennis partner had suddenly canceled their morning match. The country club's event coordinator had left a voicemail requesting upfront payment for their upcoming charity gala table. The societal walls were closing in, and she blamed my lack of intervention. She snatched a framed photograph off my mantelpiece. It was a picture of a mountain landscape. She slammed it face down on the shelf, demanding my undivided attention. Derek stepped beside her, projecting an aura of desperate authority. He unzipped a leather portfolio and extracted a dense stack of heavily highlighted financial documents. He slapped the paperwork onto my small, circular dining table. The bold heading on the first page read, "Voluntary Pension Liquidation and Early Disbursement Request." He had spent the afternoon contacting my former employer's Human Resources Department. He impersonated me, or leveraged his status as my son, to bypass the basic security protocols. He obtained the exact balance of my retirement account. They did not come to negotiate. They demanded I liquidate my pension to save them. Derek uncapped a silver fountain pen and tapped it aggressively against the signature line. He had calculated the precise withdrawal amount, down to the final decimal point. The figures accounted for the exorbitant early withdrawal penalties and the severe federal tax brackets. If I signed the authorization, the resulting wire transfer would barely cover their outstanding arrears. It would leave my retirement account at absolute zero. I would be entirely destitute, stripped of 30 years of careful financial planning. I stared down at the crisp white paper. I traced the blue ink marks Derek had meticulously drawn to guide my signature. The sheer terrifying audacity of the demand hovered in the silent room. There was no promise of repayment. There was no outline of a restructured budget or a plan to downsize their lavish lifestyle. They expected a total, unrecoverable sacrifice of my future to momentarily plug the gaping hole in their present. Monica leaned over the table, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She hissed that my refusal to sign would result in a predatory agency seizing their assets by Friday. She argued that a man of my age required very little capital to survive. She gestured dismissively at my unadorned living room as proof of my supposedly low standards. She explicitly stated that preserving their luxury aesthetic was a far superior investment than allowing my funds to stagnate in a conservative mutual fund. I picked up the silver fountain pen. Derek exhaled a sharp, jagged breath of immense relief. His shoulders dropped 2 inches. Monica's rigid posture relaxed into a smug, triumphant smirk. She crossed her arms, already calculating how quickly she could repair her fractured country club reputation once the funds cleared. Instead of lowering the pen to the signature line, I adjusted my grip. I snapped the expensive writing instrument cleanly in half. The plastic ink cartridge ruptured. It spilled a dark blue stain across the center of the voluntary liquidation form. Derek let out a strangled gasp, lunging forward to salvage the ruined document. I calmly gathered the entire stack of pension paperwork. I walked 3 steps to the corner of my home office. A heavy-duty cross-cut paper shredder sat plugged into the wall. I engaged the power switch. The machine hummed to life with a low, menacing mechanical growl. I fed the first 10 pages directly into the steel blades. The sharp teeth caught the thick parchment. They violently pulled it downward. The blades sliced their meticulously calculated demands into thousands of illegible paper ribbons. Derek screamed a raw, guttural sound of pure defeat. Monica covered her mouth, stepping backward until her spine hit the wall. I watched their arrogant delusion finally die. The shredded ribbons of my pension documents settled softly onto the hardwood floor, resembling fallen snow. The mechanical whir of the machine faded into a heavy, suffocating silence. Derek and Monica stood frozen against the wall, their earlier ferocity entirely extinguished by the brutal finality of my action. I did not raise my voice or match their chaotic energy. I simply clasped my hands behind my back, feeling the steady rhythmic pulse of my own heartbeat. A profound clarity washed over me, eliminating any residual hesitation I harbored regarding their fate. I offered a single deliberate nod. "Meet me at the Hayes Law Office tomorrow morning at exactly 10 sharp." I instructed, keeping my tone completely flat and devoid of emotion. I chose Jonathan, a ruthless litigator, specializing in ironclad asset protection, though they only knew him as the friendly attorney drafting my late wife and her will. I looked directly into Derek and his widened eyes, delivering the ultimate calculated deception. "We will sign the papers to resolve your debt." The psychological transformation in the room was instantaneous and grotesque. The rigid posture of Derek dissolved into a slumping wave of relief, followed immediately by a resurgence of his trademark arrogance. He adjusted the lapels of his designer jacket, smoothing out the wrinkles he had created during his panic. He clearly interpreted my shredding stunt as a final impotent display of boomer frustration before inevitable capitulation. He chuckled, a wet, nervous sound that morphed into a confident scoff. Monica pushed herself off the wall, the blood returning to her pale cheeks. She immediately unclasped her designer handbag and retrieved her smartphone, her thumbs flying across the glass screen. She was undoubtedly texting the country club coordinator to reinstate her charity gala table. Her social panic entirely vanished. She did not express a single syllable of gratitude. Instead, she offered a condescending smirk, loudly whispering to Derek that I had finally remembered my obligations to the family name. They did not offer to clean up the dark blue ink staining my table or the shredded paper littering my office. They simply turned and marched out of my home with the triumphant stride of conquering royalty. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind them, rattling the window panes. A moment later, the oversized engine of their obsidian SUV roared to life. I watched through the blinds as Derek aggressively reversed, digging even deeper trenches into my ruined front lawn. Before speeding off down the quiet residential street, I retrieved a dustpan and a bristled brush from the utility closet. Sweeping up the mutilated fragments of their audacious demand felt highly therapeutic. I deposited the paper waste into the recycling bin, permanently erasing their attempt to siphon my future. I then walked to my secure filing cabinet and extracted the thick black portfolio containing the freshly minted, fully transferred foreclosure deed. I organized the paperwork meticulously, ensuring the eviction clauses were highlighted in stark, undeniable yellow ink. Pulling my mobile phone from my pocket, I dialed the extension of Jonathan. He answered immediately, anticipating my call. I briefed him on the impending morning appointment, detailing the precise psychological trap I had just laid. I instructed him to draft an ironclad acknowledgement of eviction, waiving their right to any further legal appeals or extensions. Jonathan agreed to have a private security contractor present in the boardroom, anticipating the explosive volatility of their reaction once the illusion of my bailout shattered. As the evening descended, I walked into my bedroom to prepare my attire for the following day. I bypassed my casual retirement clothing and reached for a tailored charcoal suit housed in a protective garment bag. I selected a crimson tie and polished my black Oxford shoes until they mirrored the ceiling light. I wanted my physical presentation to project absolute, uncompromising authority. I was not attending a family mediation. I was presiding over a corporate execution. At precisely 9 in the evening, my phone illuminated with a new voicemail notification. Derek had called while I was showering. I played the audio message over the speakerphone. His voice dripped with patronizing warmth, reminding me to bring 2 forms of government identification to the law firm. In a display of audacity, he requested that I bring my checkbook to cover the billing rate of Jonathan, claiming his accounts were temporarily frozen. I saved the audio file, an exquisite artifact of his bottomless greed. I awoke the next morning before dawn, brewing a strong pot of black coffee. The drive into the city's center was remarkably peaceful, contrasting sharply with the impending confrontation. The urban skyline glinted under the rising sun, the towering glass structures reflecting my cold determination. I navigated the labyrinth of the financial district, pulling into the subterranean parking garage beneath the prestigious firm of Jonathan. I arrived an hour early, desiring absolute control over the environment before my targets arrived. The boardroom of Jonathan was a masterpiece of intimidation. It featured a massive, polished mahogany table spanning 20 feet, surrounded by massive windows overlooking the bustling metropolis below. The air conditioning hummed at a frigid temperature. I placed my black portfolio at the head of the table. A burly security contractor in a dark suit stood silently by the exit doors, his presence a silent guarantee of order. Jonathan sat to my right, organizing the binding eviction notices into a neat, inescapable stack. At 10:05, the heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open. Derek and Monica strolled into the freezing room entirely relaxed. They carried artisanal lattes, sipping the foam with an air of total victory. Monica wore a bright canary sundress, while Derek sported a casual linen blazer, projecting the carefree attitude of a couple whose problems had just been magically erased. They took their seats opposite me, flashing smug, victorious grins, completely unaware that the guillotine was already suspended directly above their necks. The trap was perfectly set, and they had walked right into it. The heavy oak doors of the conference room muted the ambient noise of the law firm corridors. I stood perfectly still in the antechamber, listening to the muffled, shrill voice of my daughter-in-law piercing the thick wood. Monica loudly castigated the firm administrative assistant, explicitly complaining about the poor quality of the standard office coffee provided. Her vocal entitlement confirmed my hypothesis. They believed they were arriving as victorious clients, ready to formally accept my total financial surrender. Jonathan adjusted his tortoiseshell glasses, giving me a silent, confirming nod, before turning the brass handle, and we walked in together. We stepped into the expansive, climate-controlled space. Derek and Monica were already seated, radiating an aura of undeniable arrogance. Derek slouched in a high-backed ergonomic chair, his feet brazenly resting on the edge of the polished mahogany table. Monica sat adjacent to him, scrolling through a luxury fashion application on her tablet. Neither of them bothered to stand or offer a basic greeting upon our entrance, firmly establishing their perceived dominance. Jonathan moved swiftly to the head of the table, immediately pressing the activation button on a digital audio recorder. He stated the current date, time, and the identities of all present parties for the official legal record. Derek chuckled dismissively, removing his Italian leather loafers from the table surface. He loudly joked that recording a simple familial bailout was an unnecessary theatrical flourish. He then slid a blank, unsigned promissory note toward my side of the table, explicitly instructing me to fill in the routing numbers for my liquidated pension funds immediately. I ignored the blank document entirely. Instead, I unclasped the brass lock of my black portfolio and extracted two heavily flagged financial statements. The first document was a comprehensive itemized ledger from the Whispering Pines Country Club detailing a staggering balance. The second was a finalized lease agreement for a high-end Porsche. I arranged the pages deliberately, ensuring the total outstanding balance of exactly $57,000 was prominently displayed in bold red ink. The crisp paper felt heavy with undeniable immediate consequence. Placing my fingertips on the edges of the thick paper, I pushed the documents smoothly across the conference table. They glided silently, stopping precisely inches from Derek's folded hands. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cool wood. I did not yell, nor did I project anger. I lowered my voice to a sharp, interrogative whisper and demanded a full line-item explanation for the massive expenditures. The ambient hum of the ventilation system amplified the sudden tension in the room. Derek's smug facade evaporated, instantly replaced by a ghastly, translucent pallor. His eyes darted wildly across the red numbers, his pupils dilating in genuine shock as he realized I possessed their hidden, unredacted financial records. The muscles in his jaw twitched erratically. He looked sideways at Monica, desperately seeking a lifeline, but her gaze remained rigidly locked onto the country club logo. A bead of cold sweat materialized on Derek's forehead, tracing a slow path down his temple. His breathing became shallow and rapid, the physiological manifestation of a trapped predator calculating a desperate escape route, clearing his throat with a dry, jagged cough. Derek finally attempted to speak, but only managed a fragmented, incoherent stammer. He grabbed the edges of the table, white-knuckling the wood, to steady his shaking hands. He launched into a hastily constructed, deeply flawed narrative, trying to spin a completely new web of lies by classifying the massive expenditures as absolutely vital business expenses. He claimed the luxury vehicle was a strict requirement for chauffeuring elite foreign investors, arguing that arriving in a standard sedan would instantly kill a lucrative international merger he was secretly orchestrating. Monica abruptly abandoned her frozen posture, actively jumping into the fabricated narrative to bolster her husband's collapsing story. She aggressively pointed at the country club invoice, insisting the exorbitant dining and golf fees were necessary networking costs. She fabricated a detailed anecdote about hosting the wives of these phantom foreign investors at the club's exclusive spa. She passionately argued that maintaining an elite societal facade was an agonizing but mandatory sacrifice required to secure Derek's impending promotion. Her voice reached a shrill crescendo, violently attempting to frame their reckless gluttony as a dedicated strategic career investment. I scrutinized their synchronized deception, dissecting the fatal logical flaws embedded within their excuses. My extensive corporate background immediately identified the glaring inconsistencies. The dates of the country club spa charges aligned perfectly with a weekend Derek had previously claimed they were visiting a sick relative in a neighboring state. Furthermore, the dealership lease agreement explicitly restricted the vehicle's mileage to personal use only, expressly forbidding commercial client transport. Their improvised lies were collapsing under the weight of basic scrutiny, revealing a staggering lack of sophisticated foresight. The absolute transparency of their deceit was profoundly insulting. Jonathan remained utterly silent, typing their verbatim excuses into his encrypted laptop. His rhythmic keystrokes echoed like a ticking metronome, counting down the seconds until their total destruction. I picked up a secondary file from my portfolio. It contained Derek's official employment contract and his most recent corporate tax filings documents obtained legally through the foreclosure discovery process. I prepared to systematically dismantle their business expense facade. I looked directly into Derek's panicked eyes, allowing a cold, unforgiving smile to form on my lips. The real interrogation was only just beginning, and escape was entirely impossible. The sudden vibration of Derek's mobile phone shattered the heavy silence. He flinched, instinctively reaching toward his jacket pocket, but halted halfway. He stared at the glowing screen, his face draining of any remaining color. The caller identification displayed the name of his actual corporate director. The fragile web of their financial deceit was rapidly unraveling from every conceivable angle. He realized I had forwarded the unpaid lease documents to his compliance office this morning. I raised my right hand, slicing through the stagnant air, to abruptly silence Derek's frantic, improvised babbling. He snapped his jaw shut, his teeth clicking audibly in the quiet room. Reaching into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket, I bypassed the remaining invoices and extracted a massive, thick stack of premium legal parchment. I did not slide this particular document. I dropped it flat onto the center of the mahogany table with a resounding, heavy thud. The bold, capitalized header displayed the unmistakable seal of a prominent national lending institution, explicitly outlining a home equity line of credit. The principal amount printed in the summary box was exactly $300,000. I extended my index finger, tapping the bottom right corner of the final page where the authorization signatures were mandated. A flawless replication of my unique, cursive autograph sat directly above a fraudulent notary stamp. I informed Derek that the internal fraud department at the lending institution had flagged this specific disbursement request exactly 3 days ago due to a biometric mismatch on the digital portal. They had contacted me directly to verify the IP address used to originate the loan application. I revealed that the geolocation data explicitly traced the digital submission back to his private residential network. The remaining pigment vanished from Derek's face, leaving his skin a sickly pale hue. His eyes bulged, fixated entirely on the forged ink of his own making. The facade of the arrogant, wealthy executive completely disintegrated, replaced by the hollow, trembling shell of a cornered criminal. He slumped backward into the ergonomic chair, the expensive fabric groaning under his sudden dead weight. His hands slid off the polished table, dropping limply to his sides as his breathing escalated into a shallow, desperate hyperventilation. The realization that he had crossed the boundary from civil negligence into severe felony territory visibly crushed his spine. Jonathan leaned forward, lacing his fingers together over his encrypted laptop. His voice remained chillingly calm, projecting the clinical detachment of a seasoned prosecutor. He introduced a new, terrifying reality into the boardroom by citing the specific federal statutes Derek had violated. Jonathan systematically listed Title 18 of the United States Code Section 1343 pertaining to wire fraud, alongside the aggravated identity theft provisions under Section 128A. He did not mince words, deliberately emphasizing the mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines attached to each specific charge. The legal breakdown was a calculated, agonizing process. Jonathan detailed that the unauthorized electronic transmission of the HELOC application constituted a separate federal offense for every single digital keystroke and email submitted. He explained that federal prosecutors pursued these specific financial crimes with relentless aggression, especially when the victim was a senior citizen. The potential penalties included a maximum of 30 years in a federal penitentiary, accompanied by catastrophic financial restitution orders that would permanently garnish any future wages Derek might ever earn. Jonathan casually pushed a printed copy of the sentencing matrix across the table, allowing the terrifying numbers to speak for themselves. Monica stared at the sentencing matrix, her manicured fingers trembling violently against the edge of the table. The illusion of her impenetrable societal armor shattered, exposing raw, unadulterated selfishness. She slowly turned her head toward her husband, her eyes narrowing into slits of pure, calculating malice. The unified, arrogant front they had projected upon entering the room dissolved into absolute toxicity. She aggressively shoved her chair away from Derek, creating a deliberate, physical chasm between them. Without a second of hesitation, Monica launched a vicious, preemptive strike against her husband to shield herself from the impending legal fallout. She pointed a perfectly polished fingernail directly at his chest, loudly declaring to the room that she possessed zero knowledge of the fraudulent loan application. She introduced a sudden explosive revelation, claiming Derek had surreptitiously changed all their banking passwords 3 months ago, effectively locking her out of their shared financial oversight. She screamed that he was a pathological liar who had orchestrated this entire criminal enterprise entirely in the shadows, desperately trying to construct a viable legal firewall around herself. Derek snapped out of his catatonic shock, violently rejecting his wife's sudden betrayal. He slammed his fists against his thighs, his voice cracking as he unleashed his own devastating counterattack. He revealed that the $300,000 was never intended for business expansion. It was a desperate maneuver to cover the catastrophic hidden debts Monica had accumulated through an illegal offshore gambling syndicate. He accused her of blackmailing him into forging my signature, threatening to take the children and ruin his career if he failed to secure the necessary capital to pay off her illicit creditors. The boardroom erupted into a chaotic, venomous crossfire of marital destruction. They hurled deeply guarded secrets at one another, exposing affairs, hidden accounts, and a staggering history of mutual exploitation. Monica confessed to pawning family heirlooms to fund her habits, while Derek admitted to siphoning funds from his clients' escrow accounts. The sheer magnitude of their depravity transformed the sterile corporate environment into a visceral, tragic spectacle. I sat perfectly still, observing the brutal, inevitable consequence of a foundation built entirely on greed and deception. The security contractor shifted his weight, anticipating a physical altercation, but I signaled him to remain stationed at the door. I wanted to witness the absolute final collapse of their toxic partnership. I reached across the table, retrieving the forged HELOC document from the crossfire. I commanded their attention with a sharp, authoritative demand for absolute silence. The intense screaming ceased immediately, instantly replaced by the pathetic sound of their ragged, exhausted panting, echoing loudly. I informed them that the federal authorities were already in possession of the digital evidence, and the leniency of their impending prosecution depended entirely on their absolute compliance with my strict, inflexible terms. I introduced the ultimate ultimatum: a complete uncontested surrender of all remaining familial assets to a newly established charitable trust under my exclusive control, effective immediately, leaving them penniless. The suffocating atmosphere inside the cold boardroom shattered completely as Derek aggressively lunged across the polished mahogany table, his trembling manicured hands grasping blindly at the empty air stretching between us. The sheer terrifying magnitude of my unyielding ultimatum, the total unconditional surrender of their remaining worldly assets, had completely fractured his final desperate psychological defense. Tears of genuine, unadulterated terror streamed down his pale, flushed cheeks, permanently ruining his carefully curated corporate facade. He hyperventilated uncontrollably, producing a pathetic, ragged, wheezing sound that echoed sharply off the frosted glass partition walls. His bloodshot eyes darted frantically toward the forged federal loan documents, resting quietly under my fingertips, before locking onto mine with a sickening expression of absolute, unadulterated desperation. "Dad, the bank is going to take the house," he begged, his voice violently cracking into a high-pitched, hysterical whine that instantly stripped away every single ounce of his supposed dignity. "You have to help us. They are going to seize everything by Friday." He clasped his shaking hands together in a mocking theatrical prayer, entirely oblivious to the glaring fact that his pathetic pleas for mercy were directed at the very architect of his impending destruction. He genuinely believed a faceless financial institution was independently initiating a rapid foreclosure protocol due to the massive fraud discovery entirely misinterpreting the true vengeful source of his ultimate execution. I did not flinch, nor did I offer a single fleeting gesture of paternal comfort to soothe his mounting panic. I leaned forward slowly, deliberately pressing my heavy forearms against the chilling, polished surface of the conference table, ensuring my unyielding eyes remained unblinkingly locked onto his terrified stare. The exhausting time for pointless negotiations, hidden investigations, and silent, painful endurance had officially expired. "The bank isn't taking your house, Derek," I stated, my voice dropping to a glacial, razor-sharp whisper that sliced effortlessly through his hysterical, pathetic sobbing. "I bought your debt. I am the bank now, and I am foreclosing on you." The sheer, undeniable force of those words struck him with the devastating physical impact of a swinging sledgehammer. His tense jaw went completely comically slack. I reached deep into the hidden zippered compartment of my leather portfolio and extracted a freshly notarized, brightly color-coded legal document. I slid the stiff premium parchment smoothly across the polished wood, stopping it precisely beneath his trembling chin. It was an official, legally accelerated 7-day eviction notice. I calmly explained that his documented, undeniable commission of federal wire fraud had permanently triggered an immediate, irrevocable acceleration clause embedded deep within the original mortgage contract, instantly nullifying the standard 30-day grace period I had previously granted him. Monica unleashed a loud, piercing, blood-curdling shriek, finally comprehending the absolute, undeniable totality of their financial annihilation. She violently snatched the eviction notice from the table, her widened eyes scanning the bold red typography, confirming their mandated departure date. The realization that she would be physically removed from her gated community within 1 week snapped her remaining sanity. She violently hurled her designer handbag across the room, striking the mahogany paneling with a heavy thud. She aggressively demanded that Jonathan halt the proceedings, falsely asserting that her marital rights superseded any aggressive debt collection tactics. Jonathan simply adjusted his spectacles and tapped a key on his laptop, activating a secondary projection screen mounted on the far wall. A highly detailed spreadsheet illuminated the darkness, displaying real-time tracking of her offshore gambling syndicates. He clinically informed her that the federal authorities were already monitoring those specific IP addresses. If she contested the eviction or refused to sign the charitable trust surrender forms, a comprehensive dossier detailing her illicit international wire transfers would be instantly transmitted to the Department of Justice. Her aggressive posturing evaporated into immediate, terrified compliance. With both adversaries completely neutralized, Jonathan distributed the final transfer deeds to their respective sides of the table. He provided each of them with a standard black ink pen, instructing them to initial every single page. Derek's hands shook so violently that his first signature resembled a jagged, illegible scratch. He wept silently as he signed away the equity in the metallic silver sports car, his extensive stock portfolio, and the remaining balance of his executive checking account. Monica stared blankly at the wall, her spirit entirely broken, as she mechanically authorized the liquidation of her luxury jewelry collection. The charitable trust I had established overnight would receive every single penny permanently, securing the funds to assist elderly victims of familial financial abuse. The poetic justice of repurposing their stolen wealth to protect people exactly like me provided an immense, profound satisfaction. The tedious signing process lasted exactly 14 minutes, culminating in a stack of legally binding documents that systematically stripped them of their elite societal identities. They were now officially destitute, facing impending federal investigations, with absolutely zero financial resources to secure competent legal representation. I gathered the completed paperwork, aligning the edges into a perfect stack before placing it securely inside my briefcase. I signaled the burly security contractor by the exit. He stepped forward with military precision, opening the heavy glass doors and gesturing for Derek and Monica to vacate the premises immediately. They stood up slowly, their bodies sagging under the crushing weight of their new reality. They did not exchange a final glance or utter a single word of apology. They simply shuffled out of the boardroom, like condemned prisoners marching toward the gallows. Jonathan paused the digital audio recorder, saving the irrefutable confession files to a secure cloud server. He offered a respectful, congratulatory nod, acknowledging the flawless execution of our trap. I walked out of the law firm and stepped onto the bustling city sidewalk. The crisp afternoon wind hit my face, carrying the scent of rain and urban electricity. I unlocked my vehicle, a deep sense of unburdened freedom expanding in my chest. The toxic anchor of my past had been severed completely, leaving a wide, brilliantly clear horizon stretching endlessly ahead of me. The fragile veneer of Monica's compliance violently shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She leaped to her feet with such explosive force that her heavy leather chair tipped backward, crashing loudly against the boardroom's glass partition. Her face contorted into a mask of feral desperation as she leveled a trembling, manicured finger directly at my chest. She screamed that she would drag me through a decade of brutal litigation, specifically threatening to file a massive civil lawsuit for predatory familial coercion and extreme emotional duress. She wildly declared her immediate intention to hire the most ruthless and notorious divorce and asset recovery attorney in the city to legally freeze the charitable trust before the ink could even dry on our agreements. Jonathan did not even blink at her deafening and hysterical outburst. He calmly reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a single crisp sheet of paper, sliding it smoothly across the mahogany table until it stopped inches from her clenched fists. The document was a highly magnified and verified digital photograph displaying the exact offshore routing numbers she had utilized to funnel stolen funds to her illegal gambling syndicate. Jonathan tapped his expensive gold pen against the glaring evidence, his voice dropping to a chilling and clinical whisper. He delivered the final and inescapable ultimatum. If you do not vacate quietly, this goes to the FBI. He clinically outlined how federal agents would immediately confiscate their passports and freeze every single residual asset they possessed within 24 hours. The sheer and absolute terror of a looming federal indictment instantly and completely decimated his remaining physical strength. His legs buckled entirely beneath him, failing to support the crushing weight of his monumental and undeniable defeat. He dropped heavily to the carpeted floor of the corporate boardroom, his kneecaps hitting the dense fabric with a dull and sickening thud. He completely abandoned his previous aggressive and combative strategy, pivoting instantaneously to a pathetic and visceral display of emotional manipulation. Tears streamed profusely down his flushed cheeks as he began crawling slightly forward across the floor, desperately extending his shaking arms to grasp the tailored hem of my charcoal trousers. Derek unleashed a barrage of agonizing and guttural sobs, his voice cracking violently as he begged me to reconsider this catastrophic financial execution. He aggressively invoked the sacred sanctity of our shared bloodline, desperately attempting to weaponize my fundamental paternal instincts against my logic. He wildly promised to submit to intensive and mandatory financial rehabilitation, vowing to attend daily counseling sessions to cure his rampant greed. He pleaded that my 2 grandchildren absolutely required the stable presence of their grandfather, crying hysterically that throwing his family into the brutal and unforgiving streets would permanently traumatize the next generation. He wailed, "We are family," over and over again, treating the phrase like a magical incantation that could somehow erase his felonies. I physically stepped backward, sharply, pulling the premium fabric of my suit entirely out of his desperate and sweaty grasp. I looked down at the pathetic and weeping shell of the man I had raised, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold and glacial emptiness radiating within my chest. I did not raise my voice, nor did I project even a singular ounce of residual anger. I locked my eyes directly onto his terrified and bloodshot pupils and delivered my absolute and final verdict. "You made it clear on December 23rd that I was not family enough for your dinner table," I stated, my tone cutting through the freezing air like a scalpel. "Now you are not family enough for my money." The explicit mention of that specific and freezing winter evening acted as a physical blow, instantly silencing his hysterical sobbing. I reached into my inner jacket pocket and withdrew a crumpled and water-stained photograph, dropping it onto the floor, directly in front of his kneeling posture. The image captured their lavish and brightly illuminated dining room window, teeming with wealthy and laughing guests celebrating their annual and exclusive holiday banquet. I revealed that I had driven 3 hours through a brutal blizzard that night to deliver handmade gifts for my grandchildren. Instead of a warm welcome, I was unceremoniously intercepted at their wrought iron driveway gate by a hired private security contractor. That guard explicitly informed me that my presence was strictly prohibited by the hosts, leaving me stranded in the freezing sleet while they celebrated inside. Monica stared at the water-stained photograph on the floor, her previously aggressive posture crumbling into absolute and undeniable shame. She realized instantly that her active and malicious complicity in that specific and heartless banishment had permanently sealed their catastrophic fate. She weakly attempted to deflect the blame, stammering a pathetic and transparent lie that the security guard had grossly misunderstood her explicit instructions regarding the guest list. Her desperate attempt to rewrite history failed miserably, dying instantly in the frigid and unforgiving silence of the boardroom. Suddenly, her cellular phone vibrated aggressively on the table, displaying an incoming email marked with high-priority red alert urgency. She opened the notification, reading the brief and devastating text that her prestigious country club had officially and permanently revoked her exclusive membership due to extreme reputational risk. I ignored her fresh wave of panicked tears and introduced the final and non-negotiable logistical parameters of their impending exile. I informed them that they possessed exactly 48 hours to pack a strict maximum of 2 standard-sized travel suitcases, each explicitly forbidding the removal of any luxury items, expensive electronics, or designer apparel. A private and bonded liquidation crew, directly hired and fully authorized by my newly established trust, would arrive at their property on Thursday morning at precisely 6 a.m. This specialized team would meticulously inventory every single remaining artifact within the estate, preparing the high-value assets for an immediate and aggressive public auction to maximize the charitable foundation initial capital. Derek slumped silently against the cold glass. He finally grasped the sheer totality of his financial annihilation. My retribution was completely finalized. Day 7 arrives with a piercing sunrise, illuminating the affluent suburban street. I sit silently in the cab of my heavy truck parked discreetly across the avenue from the sprawling estate. Precisely at 6, a commercial flatbed tow truck reverses aggressively onto the stamped concrete driveway, its reverse alarm echoing through the quiet neighborhood. 2 burly repo men jump down instantly, attaching thick steel winches to the axles of the metallic silver Porsche. The lead agent slaps a set of magnetic towing lights onto the pristine roof, finalizing the seizure. Derek bursts through the mahogany front doors wearing a stained undershirt and mismatched sweatpants. He sprints down the cobblestone path, wildly attempting to block the flatbed hydraulic ramp from retracting. The tow truck driver ignores the frantic posturing, handing my son a yellow clipboard holding a secondary court mandate. This particular repossession bypasses my charitable trust entirely. An independent auto loan creditor has simultaneously moved in to extract their pound of flesh. Monica marches out of the foyer moments later, dragging a chaotic pile of loose designer clothing across the damp morning grass. They have procured a battered, rust-spotted moving box truck, which currently sits parked illegally atop the meticulously manicured lawn. The heavy tires crush a pristine bed of imported petunias into a brown paste. She begins aggressively stuffing delicate silk dresses and expensive cashmere coats directly into the filthy cargo bay of the rented vehicle. The mounting logistical pressure instantly detonates into a vicious, highly public screaming match directly on the front lawn. Monica hurls a velvet-lined shoebox straight at Derek, missing his head by mere inches. She screams that a secondary freeze has just been placed on her high-limit emergency credit card. A bank representative had called her at dawn, freezing the account due to immediate cross-default clauses triggered by the primary mortgage collapse. Derek retaliates instantly by gathering a fistful of her imported leather handbags and throwing them into the waterlogged street gutter. He bellows a devastating new revelation across the yard. He informs her that the Elite Country Club Board of Directors has officially initiated a highly damaging defamation lawsuit against her. The legal action stems from thousands of dollars in unpaid fraudulent group vacation expenses she had secretly charged to her former friends' subsidiary accounts. The chaotic, deafening commotion rapidly draws an eager captive audience from the surrounding mansions. The elite neighbors step out onto their sprawling porches, clutching their plush monogrammed bathrobes tightly against the morning chill. The president of the local homeowners association, a man named Sterling, stands squarely at the edge of his property line. He holds his smartphone horizontally, actively recording the catastrophic domestic meltdown in high definition. The carefully curated illusion of their untouchable wealth is publicly and permanently shattered. Monica spots the glowing red recording light on the neighboring phone. Instead of retreating in shame, she sprints aggressively toward the iron property fence dividing the yards. She desperately demands that Sterling intervene and temporarily offer them the use of his expansive guest suite until the current misunderstanding blows over. Sterling does not utter a single word in response. He simply turns his back in utter disgust, walks inside his foyer, and throws the heavy deadbolt lock with a loud clack. The bonded liquidation crew finally arrives, interrupting the neighborhood spectacle. A team of 6 men in matching gray uniforms bypasses the arguing couple entirely, marching straight into the open residence. 10 minutes later they emerge, carrying a massive custom-built grand piano, awkwardly maneuvering the heavy instrument down the marble front steps. Derek watches his prized possession get unceremoniously strapped into the back of a commercial auction van, utterly powerless to halt the systematic dismantling of his inflated ego. A sleek, unmarked black sedan pulls up directly behind my parked truck, turning off its headlights. A stern investigator from the Federal Wire Fraud Division steps out onto the pavement, flashing a silver badge attached to his belt. He walks deliberately toward the screaming couple on the lawn, clutching a thick manila envelope bursting with formal grand jury subpoenas. The sheer gravity of his approach acts as a sudden suffocating muzzle on their public argument. The federal agent physically separates them, calmly reading them their mandated legal rights regarding the rapidly expanding offshore gambling probe. Without a solitary second of hesitation, Monica immediately attempts to throw Derek under the bus to save herself. She loudly offers to testify as an official state witness against her husband's extensive corporate embezzlement network in direct exchange for total federal immunity. She rapidly lists specific, hidden digital ledgers he maintains on a secondary hard drive. Derek's reaction to her ultimate treacherous betrayal is swift and violent. He turns away from the federal agent and savagely kicks the heavy steel bumper of the moving truck, audibly fracturing his own toe in the process. Ignoring the searing physical pain, he limps pathetically toward the passenger side of the rented vehicle. He hauls himself into the cabin and violently slams the metal door shut, abandoning his terrified wife on the ruined grass with the federal investigator. I reach forward and firmly turn the ignition key of my truck, the engine roaring to life with a steady, comforting rumble. My dashboard calendar system chimes brightly, sending a digital notification regarding my inaugural morning meeting with the newly appointed board of the charitable foundation. The transition from a silent, observing victim to an active, empowered philanthropist commences right at this very second. I pull the gear shift into drive and accelerate away from the curb, leaving the chaotic, fractured scene rapidly shrinking in my rearview mirror. The local radio station begins playing a subtle, upbeat jazz melody that fills the cabin with positive energy. The heavy morning fog finally burns off, revealing a brilliant, cloudless blue sky that perfectly mirrors the absolute, unshakable clarity of my newly reclaimed existence. The real estate market experienced an aggressive surge, maximizing the final valuation of the foreclosed Newton estate. A wealthy foreign executive submitted a blind all-cash offer exceeding the appraisal. I sat in a downtown escrow office endorsing the transfer deed. The wire transaction cleared, instantaneously flooding my newly established philanthropic trust with an unprecedented wave of liquid capital. I redirected those funds immediately, purchasing an abandoned 10-acre industrial complex on the eastern outskirts of the city. The property requires extensive environmental remediation and structural reinforcement. Today, a heavy, unseasonal rainstorm transformed the central loading yard into a dense expanse of thick brown mud. I step out of my vehicle, my waterproof boots sinking deep into the viscous clay, inhaling the sharp, metallic scent of fresh diesel exhaust. A towering crane lowers a custom-fabricated wrought iron archway over the primary entrance gate. Sparks rain down violently as masked welders fuse the heavy letters into place. The imposing sign reads, "The Patricia Caldwell Trade Academy." Seeing her maiden name permanently forged into unyielding steel solidifies my new purpose. This institution serves as a tangible monument to her lifelong belief in the redemptive power of honest, grueling physical labor. The administrative logistics required rapid execution. I successfully acquired a diverse fleet of decommissioned commercial vehicles at a municipal vehicle auction, securing heavy excavators, articulated dump trucks, and industrial forklifts. To ensure premier educational standards, I actively recruited senior foremen from local labor unions. These seasoned veterans now serve as the primary instructional faculty, bringing decades of invaluable, unfiltered job site experience directly to the newly constructed outdoor classrooms. Our inaugural academic cohort consists exclusively of 20 young adults selected from the state's aging-out foster care system. These individuals possess zero financial safety nets and face daunting socioeconomic barriers. This morning, I personally distributed their essential safety equipment, handing out reinforced steel-toed boots, high-visibility reflective vests, and specialized protective eyewear. Providing this professional-grade gear instantly alters their physical posture, instilling a sudden, undeniable sense of professional authority and belonging they have never previously experienced. I walked toward the designated earth-moving sector, watching a 19-year-old student named Jason approach a colossal bright yellow bulldozer. He climbs the muddy metal treads with profound hesitation and eager anticipation. He pulls himself into the elevated operator cabin, carefully adjusting the heavy suspension seat to accommodate his frame. The massive diesel engine roars to life, vibrating the ground beneath my feet with raw mechanical power, sending a thick plume of smoke into the overcast sky. Jason tentatively engages the primary hydraulic levers, lowering the massive steel blade until it bites aggressively into the wet earth. He executes a surprisingly smooth, complex grading maneuver, pushing a ton of heavy clay across the designated training perimeter. The chief instructor stands nearby, nodding with genuine approval and flashing a decisive thumbs up. A bright smile breaks across the young operator's face, illuminating the dark cabin. Witnessing this instantaneous, profound skill acquisition fills my chest with an immense, unfamiliar warmth. The stark atmosphere of this muddy proving ground stands in absolute defiance of the very sterile corporate world I recently dismantled. There are no deceptive spreadsheets, hidden agendas, or toxic social climbing maneuvers permitted within these chain-link fences. Success here is measured exclusively by visible dirt, sweat, and the precise execution of mechanical commands. It represents an environment of pure honesty, completely devoid of the suffocating entitlement that previously poisoned my existence. I finalized a series of binding partnership contracts with the 5 largest commercial development firms in the surrounding tri-state area. These lucrative agreements guarantee immediate high-paying union apprenticeships for every cadet who successfully graduates from our intensive 6-month program. By eliminating the terrifying uncertainty of the job market, we are effectively constructing an immediate, indestructible bridge leading directly to long-term, middle-class stability, completely bypassing the predatory student loan debt crisis altogether. An independent architectural firm delivered the comprehensive expansion blueprints to my temporary field office just before lunch. Phase 2 of the Academy's development involves constructing sustainable on-site dormitories and a fully staffed, subsidized cafeteria. This ambitious residential initiative will completely eradicate housing insecurity for enrolled students, allowing them to focus their mental energy entirely on mastering their chosen trades. I authorize the immediate release of the necessary construction permits, pushing the aggressive development timeline forward by several crucial months. The gray storm clouds finally break apart, allowing a vibrant sunset to bleed across the jagged industrial skyline. Automated high-intensity halogen floodlights flicker to life across the perimeter, casting long, dramatic shadows over the resting machinery. The loud rhythmic blast of the shift horn signals the official conclusion of our highly productive operations. The exhausted students dismount their respective vehicles, their uniforms coated in a thick layer of grime, laughing as they head toward the locker rooms. I retreat to the quiet, insulated cabin of my heavy-duty pickup truck, shutting the heavy door against the damp evening chill. I settle into the leather seat, resting my calloused hands on the steering wheel. I pull my mobile device from my jacket pocket, tapping the glass screen to illuminate the current display. The notification panel remains completely blank, displaying 0 missed calls, 0 frantic text messages, and 0 desperate voicemails demanding immediate financial rescue. The absolute silence radiating from the small digital device represents the ultimate, undeniable victory of my newly established boundaries. I proactively deleted a specific toxic contact from my directory weeks ago, ensuring that particular avenue of emotional manipulation remains permanently sealed. I do not wonder about their current location, their impending legal battles, or the fragile state of their shattered social standing. The exhausting burden of managing their catastrophic, self-inflicted crises has been entirely and permanently lifted from my shoulders. I slide the silent phone back into my pocket, I have successfully amputated a parasitic entity, losing a son, completely consumed by greed, but reclaiming my fundamental dignity in the process. The roaring diesel engines of the Academy secure my late wife's true legacy-building futures instead of funding empty illusions. Family ties should be a foundation of mutual respect, not a free pass for exploitation. When we constantly shield those we love from the consequences of their own greed, we don't save them. We teach them that betrayal carries no cost. True love sometimes requires the courage to step aside and let a person fall into the pit they dug themselves. By refusing to be a victim of my son's financial abuse, I broke a toxic cycle. Boundaries are the ultimate act of self-respect. If someone values you for what you can pay for, they don't value you at all. If you believe that respect must be earned even from your family, hit that like button to support this channel. Subscribe today so you never miss another story of truth and justice. Drop a comment below. Would you have evicted your own son in my exact shoes? Let me know.